Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of The Leftovers Season 3, Episode 8, The Book of Nora, the series finale. This video is a final part of a series of videos where I review episodes of The Leftovers, so I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for The Leftovers up to the series finale. If you haven't seen all of The Leftovers, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. So this episode wasn't like last week's episode where I immediately thought it was the best thing ever. It was more like episode 6, where while I was watching it, I didn't like it very much, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. In fact, that's even more true for this episode, as the more I think about it, the more I absolutely positively love it. It's interesting that they chose Nora to focus on for the final episode, as Kevin has traditionally been the main character of the show, but I think the main reason it was done was because her storyline was more open to abstract interpretation, and her storyline has always dealt more directly with the departure, which was more important to focus on in the final episode of this show. And they wrapped up Kevin's storyline in the penultimate episode, leaving it open to address Nora and Kevin's need to reconcile with each other in this episode. Also, I do have to mention the opening credits, as many had predicted that we would get the song from Season 2 over the credits, which the theme is Let the Mystery Be, as that's sort of the final message that the show wants to put out there, is that let the mystery be. So I'm going to compare this episode to two other series finales, as I think it's relevant, as I can see a lot of similarities between them. The first one I'll bring up is the Lost finale. Naturally, and I'll get into some pretty hefty spoilers with it, so if you don't want to have the ending of Lost spoiled for you, you may want to skip this next section. And the other finale I'll compare it to is the Black Sails series finale. However, I won't get into any specific spoilers with that finale, and we'll just talk about it in very vague terms. But if you're highly sensitive about spoilers and don't want to know a single solitary detail about Black Sails, then you may want to skip this next section. So, the Lost comparison is rather obvious, as that was also a show where Damon Lindelof was a showrunner, and the reason I think it's relevant here is because I strongly feel that what Lindelof attempted to accomplish with Lost, and particularly with the series finale, and failed to accomplish, he managed to get right with the Leftovers and accomplish it here. As in the finale, they attempted to have an episode that was abstract and could be interpreted in many ways, and it kind of failed, as it ended up letting a lot of people down and also confused a bunch of people who widely misinterpreted the ending, while many who did get what they were going for didn't care to speculate, as they were unhappy with how this affected the show, and this as an ending of the show. But with the Leftovers, they found a way that could be interpreted in multiple ways and is likely not going to be misinterpreted, and in fact found a way to please pretty much everyone. With Lost, Lindelof was quoted as saying, "It was impossible to please everyone," a statement in which I deemed was a giant cop-out. As while that may be true, they could have come up with an ending that pleased the majority of people, or at least a lot more than they did. And so just to say, oh, we can't please everyone, just seems like a cop-out to not own up to, not even try. And by all popular accounts, yeah, people were not, the majority of people anyway, were not pleased with the ending of Lost. However, the ending of The Leftovers were purposely left open in such a way that regardless of which way you lean, you can find an interpretation to please you or to suit your needs. And that was absolutely brilliant. So in the way, Lindelof proved himself wrong and me right by proving that there is a way to end a show like Lost, because Leftovers is very similar to Lost, in a way that is more pleasing to just about everyone. And in a way, the entire third season of The Leftovers was Lindelof learning from his mistakes with Lost and doing what he tried to do with the final season of Lost but failed, and actually getting it right here, such as the afterlife. As when in the Lost finale it was revealed that the flash sideways was an afterlife, many people, including myself, felt this was executed extremely poorly and didn't at all do justice to the series that came before it, and in fact confused a lot of people into thinking that these characters were really dead since the original plane crash, which was not at all what Lindelof and the creators were trying to say. Whereas with the way the Leftovers handled the afterlife was absolutely brilliant and only enhanced the overall show and left open a lot of valid interpretations without being too confusing. And also Lost tried to play to, the fans by playing up a popular fan theory of them being in purgatory the whole time, but used it with these flash sideways instead, which only served to confuse people. And as a theory, I think frankly that the show runners were better off just leaving alone and not touching. Whereas The Leftovers managed to integrate a popular fan theory and make it a valid possibility without making it too confusing. So my hat's totally off to Lindelof and the creative team behind The Leftovers for pulling this off so well. Now, the Black Sails comparison might be a bit more surprising, but those who saw the Black Sails finale and my review for it may know where I'm coming from, as with that finale I didn't like it at all when I first watched it because I took it at face value. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it could be interpreted in several different ways, and like the Leftovers finale, the Black Sails finale presented a possibility told entirely by one character without us actually seeing these events unfold on screen. And while my first instinct in both cases was to take this story at face value, the fact that we don't see these events unfold and that they are simply told to us by one character, we the audience are forced to make the decision on whether or not to believe them, and thus everyone will come up with their own interpretation which suits them best. And I think The Leftovers even set this up further from Black Sails, and what's more, that is far more ambiguous and abstract, and I think it was a masterpiece, frankly, that was so beautifully accomplished. So as I go into the review this episode, instead of going through like a recap scene by scene as I did with last week's episode, I'm going to jump right to the end, as I think that sort of dictates how one views this episode. And of course I'll be looking at this from my perspective, as this episode is highly interpretive. But the way I see it is that there are three main possibilities on what happened in this episode, or three main interpretations of what went down in this episode. The first interpretation is the face value interpretation. That is, you take everything that happened in this episode at face value, and more importantly, what Nora said at the end of this episode at face value. That Nora traveled into another world where the 2% that departed actually remained, and it was the 98% of the world that departed, and she found her family no longer needed her, so she returned to our world. The second interpretation is the Nora Lied possibility, and that is that you can take everything in this episode at face value, such as Kevin saying that he was just pretending to not know her, but Nora's story at the end of the episode was a lie. That in actual fact, when Nora went into the radiation ball, she called out to the scientists and told them to stop, and then left the machine and just went off into Australia and effectively faked her own death, and thus made up this story about going to the other world, as she didn't want to tell Kevin what really happened. And the third interpretation that I want to cover is the Nora died possibility. And that is, when Nora went into the radiation ball, she died. And what we experienced in this episode afterwards with, her as an older person, is her afterlife. It's her hotel, if you will. And I think there's evidence for all three possibilities, so audience members can lean whichever way they like. And of course, I'm sure many will come up with other possibilities and other different intricates and different caveats within these because it just could be interpreted in so many different ways. But for the purposes of this review, I'll look at it through these three possibilities. So out of these three possibilities, to my mind, they just perfectly serve what different people may want to get out of this show or out of an ending of the show. As the face value interpretation, I believe, will be the most popular interpretation and will serve the purpose of many casual viewers who don't want to look much further too deep into the show. But that's not to say that it will only please casual fans, and I'm not at all meant to imply that this interpretation is more shallow or anything like that. I have to reassert that all three possibilities are completely valid. However, this one serves the interest of those who want an answer to the departure, as many have been dying for an answer. What happened to this 2% of the world that departed? And I was actually quite surprised they gave us an answer. And the answer they gave was a popular fan theory that there is another world where it wasn't the 2% that departed, it was the 98% that departed. And so those who wanted a rational scientific explanation to what happened to those who departed got one, which again surprised me, but it was brilliant that they were able to do this. But at the same time, appeasing those who didn't want what happened at the departure to be answered, you get the other interpretations. And with the Nora lying interpretation, this appeases more those who see the leftovers as more realistic, more tangible, and rational, and without any mysticism. So in this interpretation, there is no other dimension. What happened to the departed remains a mystery, and most likely, all the other mystical occurrences weren't mystical at all. Like Kevin didn't go into an afterlife, that he was just delusional, as we see in the fact that he's vulnerable through his heart attack in this episode. So this interpretation serves the needs of those more rational minded. And then you have the Nora died interpretation, which also leaves the departure as a mystery, but more embraces the supernatural and mysticism rather than rejecting it. Kevin did really go into an afterlife, and in fact Nora went there herself, and like Kevin, she has to confront her demons before she can move on. And ironically, this interpretation is similar to the ending of Lost, where the loved ones who died meet in an afterlife so they can reconnect. So let's get into each of these three possibilities more, and I'll do this in order of my personal least favorite interpretation to my personal favorite. And again, all three interpretations are completely valid. I'm simply stating the ones that I personally gravitate towards the most and the least. So the one I feel the least attracted to personally is the face value interpretation. The main reason being is I don't want an answer to the departure, and I mentioned before at first I didn't like this episode, and that's because I did take it at face value, and honestly I didn't think much of it. But let's look at the evidence for the face value possibilities. So at the start of the episode, when Nora is reading the statement that the scientists have everyone read, Dr. Becker said that she didn't believe her and said she was lying, but Nora strongly insisted that she was not lying, specifically saying, "I do not lie." And that gives a pretty convincing speech about how badly she wants to go to the machine. She tracked them down, blah, blah, blah. So if she wants to go so badly, why would she want to back out? After that, we flash to the future. We get a scene of Nora talking to Lori, which of course suggests that Lori did not kill herself, as was many suspected in episode 6. Lori was with a baby, which would make sense because later Kevin would tell Nora that Jill recently had a baby, so it would make sense for Lori to be with a baby, as opposed to if Nora was in some sort of afterlife, then what's the deal with the baby? Whose baby is that? And also Nora is, talking to Lori, seeking therapy. Why would she need therapy if she was dead? And it all matches up that if Nora's story is true, that she'd hide away in the world because she'd be afraid no one would believe her, which is why she asked Kevin if he believed her and was surprised when he said yes. And the way Kevin behaved when he finally admitted that yes, he did know her all along, that he made up a story in order to make it easier to talk to Nora is plausible. And it could be he's just being completely honest, because he does seem like the old Kevin here, in that scene when he pulled up with the car. He seemed very sort of aggressive, particularly when he brings up the book that he burned. And also Kevin talks about not smoking because of his heart condition. So why would he worry about not smoking if he was dead? Plus, we learn about what's happened with his children and how they don't really refer to Jordan as Miracle anymore. And then there's Nora's story itself, which was quite elaborate, so it seems a little far-fetched that she just made it all up. And plus, this totally fits that her family would have moved on without her, and she would feel out of place and want to come back. And how she got back is totally and completely fits. As in an earlier episode, Dr. Becker and Dr. Eden mentioned the inventor of the machine and that he had already went over to the other side. So the story of how she came back makes sense, and in fact was set up for in previous episodes. And it's also interesting why she never contacted Kevin, because so much time had passed as it took her years to get back to, the real world or her world. And thus she felt out of touch with him by the time she got back. And also, this explained why she didn't go to Matt's funeral, which Kevin was angry about, because at the time she would have still been in Bizarro World or Departure World or whatever you want to call it. So naturally, she couldn't make the funeral. But just in general, the afterlife we've seen before has always been a lot more bizarre, with the signature like classical music and involved a bunch of like absurd shit and a lot of dead people that Kevin knew playing different roles, where in this place the only two people Nora sees that she knows are Lori and Kevin, and they are both Lori and Kevin. They're not playing like different weird roles. And overall, this world seems pretty straightforward and realistic. So now let's talk about my second favorite interpretation, and that is the possibility that Nora lied. So when Nora was reading her statement and Dr. Becker doubts her and calls her a liar, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe Dr. Becker can tell she doesn't really want to go, which would also explain why they rejected her in the first place. Dr. Eden is impressed by her speech and the fact that she went through these great lengths to find him, but perhaps Dr. Becker can see something that she cannot. And as Dr. Becker never really liked Nora in the first place. And I know for the other interpretation I mentioned that Nora said she didn't lie, or she does not lie, but later in this episode the Australian nun catches Nora in a lie, proving that she does in fact lie. So perhaps the biggest evidence for this interpretation is that they clearly established that there is a two-way communication within that little ball thingy, so that when Nora can hear what Dr. Eden and Matt are saying, and they can hear her. And at first I thought this was kind of pointless, as she didn't really see, they didn't really have anything to say after that. She was just like, "Can you hear me?" And that's all they said. So what's the point of having communication if they don't actually communicate? But then we see the fluid come in and Nora starts to freak out, and the most telling thing of all is that the scene cuts before her head goes under the liquid, thus leaving open the possibility that she called out to Dr. Eden to stop, and it has been established that Dr. Eden could clearly hear her and would be able to stop it, thus proving Dr. Becker's suspicions correct. In fact, if you watch the scene, you can see Nora leaning her head back right as the water is about to go over her head, and she leans her head back like she's about to say something, like she's about to shout something, and very clearly it looks like the word she's about to say is stop, but then the scene cuts. So the question one might then ask, if Nora didn't go into the other dimension, why would Matt lie about it? And that is answered by the scenes we get previously where we saw Matt and Nora bonding, making it clear Matt would most assuredly be willing to lie on Nora's behalf. Another piece of evidence in this regard could be the fact that Nora is still in touch with Lori. And Lori, not for a single solitary second, would believe the story about Nora going into Departure World. So why would Nora choose Lori to contact, if that being the case? It may make more sense, however, if Nora didn't go into Bizarro World and was just hiding from the world, so it seems logical then to contact someone like Lori. Also, when Kevin first tells Nora he was hoping she'd go to Matt's funeral, she tells him that they already said their goodbyes, which was true as we saw them bonding before she went into the machine, and if indeed she did go out of the machine again, she would have had even more time to say goodbye to Matt. Okay, so now let's get into the Nora's story of going to the other side. First of all, I find it hard to believe that if they were indeed only 2% of the world's population in this bizarro world, that they'd be as spread out as described in this episode, as it seems for survival purposes they would need to congregate more. And her story about her family being the lucky ones because in that world they had each other, and that's when she realized she didn't belong there. She could have actually stopped and realized this and came to this realization before the liquid took over, and that's why she yelled stop. And also, if what she said was true, that she traveled all the way to Mapleton, New York, which took her years, and then to where that physicist was, why then, when she got back to the real world or our world or whatever, did she go back to Australia to live? Why choose Australia instead of just staying wherever you were or moving anywhere else in the world you feel like? It's over because the scientists have, Dr. Becker or whatever, the radiation scientists have been established as moving all over the world. So I doubt that this original scientist would still be in Australia. He probably never was even in Australia. He'd probably still be in Europe somewhere. But if she never went through and she simply got out of the machine, it would make total sense for her to still be in Australia because that's where she was. And what she meant about too much time passing to call Kevin is that she couldn't bring herself to do it, and over time it just got easier to not call him. And of course, when she asked Kevin if he believed her and she was surprised that he said he did, it's because she was lying. So now let's get to my favorite interpretation, or rather the interpretation I personally choose to go with, that I gravitate more towards, and that is the possibility that Nora died when the machine took effect. So this is the theory that what the scientists are doing is bullshit and they're simply killing people. So this could be wittingly or unwittingly. I personally think that the scientists think the machine is working. And so when Nora gets in the machine, it does fill up with liquid and go off, but the only result is it kills her. And so according to this interpretation, what we see in the first part of this episode before Nora gets into the machine is the real world, but everything after in her visions in the afterlife. So it could be she instantly, goes there as an old woman, or it could be she's been there for a long time, stuck in purgatory because she's unable to move on and is just hiding from the world. Now, one of the strongest pieces of evidence for this interpretation in my mind is the fact that we only see 3 known characters in this part of the episode: Nora, Kevin, and Lori. Now, with Lori, it was already hinted at that she killed herself, which I still very strongly believe it was the case that she killed herself. So that would explain why she was there long before Kevin was. And with Kevin, when Nora refers to him as immortal, he says that he isn't, and talks about a heart attack that he had. Now here he said he recovered, but maybe that's just part of this afterlife narrative, and in fact he was killed by this heart attack. And it is interesting that he specifically says that he is not immortal. So this could be implying that Kevin did in fact die when he had this heart attack, which occurred just 2 years prior to the scene. So that would explain why Nora hasn't seen Kevin all this time, because he hadn't died yet, whereas Lori had died, which is why she was in contact with her the whole time. And also, this is a really minor thing, but when we see Lori on the phone to Nora, she looks to be in a cold and dreary place that doesn't at all look like Jordan, and where Kevin said she was still living in Jordan. But this looks more like Mapleton to my eye. Of course, she could be visiting some other place, or maybe I'm just reading too much into this. And then when Nora tells Lori, Kevin seemed happy, she goes, huh, like it's something very surprising, like she wouldn't think Kevin would be all happy. And if indeed Lori had been living in the same town as Kevin, this wouldn't be news to her, but it would be news to her if she died when she went scuba diving, as Kevin was not really happy when she left at that point, and because he was just about to kill himself. But let's talk about Kevin's behavior, because that's actually the thing that's got me believing in this theory the most. So when he shows up at Nora's house, he claims not to know her well, and tells her that he only remembers her from the dance. Later, when Nora goes to the wedding, the dance that turns out to be a wedding, she keeps challenging him, and at every turn he firmly denies it. He even says things like, if she had offered to go to Miami, he would have definitely says yes, because he loved Miami. In particular, she kept asking her how he found her, and he genuinely seemed confused. In fact, when she asked how Jill and Tommy are, Kevin finds it a bit creepy that she knows his children's name. So I know later we get a scene where Kevin confesses to putting on an act so they could start over again, but I don't for an instant buy that. It seems to me he's taking it way too far, and I think it makes a lot more sense that this Kevin generally does not know Nora. It seems pretty obvious that he absolutely believes what he's saying, because some of these things are so absurd, like saying that the fact that she knows his kid's name is creepy. I just can't see him saying something like that if this is just an act. However, it makes a hell of a lot more sense if this is Nora's afterlife, because we saw in Kevin's afterlife that other people take on different personas, and that they don't remember certain events from their real life. So this could be, in fact, be the exact same thing that's happening here, that this Kevin is not remembering things from his afterlife and taking on a character of this particular afterlife world. And the fact Kevin completely changes back to his old self and claims to be putting on an act could be that his character needed to change in order to get Nora to get where she needed to be. And the fact that Nora saved the goat and took all those beads that signifies everyone's burdens may have something to do with why this change in Kevin took place. I mean, I mentioned earlier that characters weren't really acting absurd, but Kevin totally is. And he's more than that, he's acting completely out of character. He's acting completely happy and cheerful, and so that does seem really absurd. And even Lori thought that was really weird. And the thing that happened with the goat was a bit absurd as well. That seemed pretty afterlife-y as well. And also the scene with the nun lying about having sex with that guy seemed a bit weird and out of place. And by having the nun lie, this could also be signifying that Nora is lying to herself. So let's talk about the bath scene where Nora climbs into the bathtub full of water, which was very reminiscent of her climbing into that ball that was filled with liquid. And when she did that, she had to pull behind this latch that, was locked the little ball in place. And here the bathroom door locks, and she sort of had to put it in place like a hatch, and she's unable to open it, and she frantically bangs on it. So this could be that it's reminding her of the moment of her death, which is why she's so frantic to get out. And the whole incident could be her subconscious trying to remind her and let her know that she is dead. So then we get Nora's story, and in this context, it doesn't matter if she's making it up or if she really believes it. Bottom line, none of this is true. When she got into the machine, she was incinerated and just died. The point is, in telling the story, she's able to finally move past her departed family and be with Kevin, as Kevin believes her and forgives her. So similarly to Kevin's journey in the afterlife, Nora's journey in the afterlife involves her coming to terms with her love for Kevin and learning to move past this, her issues, and in order to reconnect with him. And then there are the doves. When Nora was at the wedding with Kevin and ran away from him, refusing to speak with him, the doves flew away and refused to return. But once she reconciled with Kevin, the doves finally returned. To me, this is another big hint that this is a surreal afterlife, that the doves were responding to Nora because the afterlife world is created by her and exists just for her and thus responds to her. So the whole point is her learning to move past her issues to reconcile with Kevin. So when she pushed them away, the doves weren't happy, which is why they didn't return. But when she was able to actually reconcile with Kevin, the doves returned, signifying that she was doing the right thing. So again, I'm not trying to convince anyone that this interpretation is the only objective option, because that most definitely is not the case. I am just stating why I personally identify with it. In fact, that is a major brilliance of this episode, is that it is so open to interpretation, making this the perfect finale for The Leftovers. Apparently, the synopsis for this episode reads that everything is answered, nothing is answered, and then it all ends. And that is the perfect summary for this episode, because it all depends on how you look at it, and it's absolutely positively brilliant. There are many more interpretations that I can get to, and a lot of other scenes you could dissect. I could go on for hours, but I only have a limited time for this review. So my rating for the Book of Nora out of 10 is quite easily a 10 the best. And an absolutely amazing episode that was the perfect ending for this show. It answered all of your questions, but at the same time, it totally didn't. It all depends on how you look at it. And it's such a fitting ending for this show to not really answer anything and to leave everything up to the viewer's interpretation. And the way this was done was truly inspiring and nothing short of pure genius. So I do believe this is one of the best series finales that I've ever seen. Although that isn't a particularly high bar to meet, as the majority of series finales I've seen I describe as okay at best. There are a few exceptions that are absolutely brilliant final episodes, like Star Trek Next Generation and Breaking Bad, and I dare say this episode makes that top 3 for me. I'm still unsure where it ranks among those 3, but one thing's for certain, it was absolutely brilliant. So that's it for my review of the Book of Nora, but not it for my coverage of the Season 3 of The Leftovers, as this Thursday night, 8 p.m. Pacific Time in the U.S., I'll be doing a live discussion video with my brother Atkin Tomko, where we'll be going over Season 3 of The Leftovers, so make sure to join us live in the chat for that, or check us out in the archives afterwards. I'll put a link in the description below for that. Also, be sure to check out my channel for many other videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Better Call Saul, Dark Matter, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.